c'est un plaisir d'introduire ce nouveau webinaire de la Société Française d'exobiologie. Donc on en a, ça fait 1 an maintenant à peu près qu'on a lancé ces webinaires. Ils sont enregistrés. Vous pouvez retrouver les anciens webinaires sur la chaîne de la Société Française d'exobiologie. Donc, on a déjà parlé des virus, des climats des exoplanètes, des météorites et de l'origine de l'eau, de vivre sur Mars, de l'origine des cellules complexes du vivant. Et on essaye, comme l'est l'exobiologie, d'illustrer un peu toute la diversité des thématiques qui sont couvertes par l'exobiologie, qui concerne non seulement la recherche de la vie ailleurs, mais aussi la recherche de l'origine de la vie sur la Terre. Et je suis vraiment très heureux que Antonio Lazcano, qui est un ami de longue date de beaucoup de chercheurs en France qui travaillent sur ces questions, donc qu'Antonio, qui est professeur de biologie, chercheur au Collège national mexicain et à la Faculté des sciences de l'UNAM, l'Université nationale autonome de Mexique, et accepté de donner ce webinaire aujourd'hui. Donc, Antonio est quelqu'un qui connaît très bien, en plus de la science et de sa recherche de premier plan sur les origines de la vie, connaît aussi très bien l'histoire qui a petit à petit amené la question des origines de la vie dans le champ de la science et de la rationalité. Donc, Antonio a très bien connu, par exemple, Stanley Miller. Il nous en parlera, j'en suis sûr. Il a été 2 fois président de l'ISOL, l'International Society for the Study of the Origin of Life. Et voilà, je pense qu'ayant dit ça, j'ai pas tout dit, ce serait trop long de tout dire, mais voilà, je voulais juste remercier à nouveau Antonio sincèrement, et j'ai le plaisir de te laisser la parole pour nous parler de l'histoire des origines de la vie. Merci encore, Antonio.
Merci, Hervé. I'm quite grateful to all of you for your patience and first of all, for the invitation to have the chance to talk to you. I'm not a professional historian, as Hervé already noted, not at all. But I have always been fascinated by the issue of the origins of life in historical terms because of a very simple reason. When one thinks about the way that the field developed, one has to take into account that it happened during the Stalinist period. It coincides with the birth of molecular biology. It coincides with the La Guerre Froide, the Cold War. It coincides with the birth of space exploration and with the major debates about the nature and the origins of life that took place during the past century, issues that are far from being resolved. And also, and I became aware of this quite recently, when I was preparing this seminar, I realized that, like many of you, many of my friends and my colleagues in the field, we had the chance to interact with the founders of the field, like Oparin, like Stanley Miller, like Joan Oro, Leslie Orgel, Lynn Margulis, and so on. And now the field has exploded into something that my American friends like to call astrobiology. I adhere to the French idea of exobiology. And then I realized that the reason why a number of us had the chance to interact with the founders of the field was because we were living in a transition between what the people used to call small science and big science. Derek de Soya Price, who was a major sociologist of science, said in the 1960s, wrote in the 1960s, that the way science was growing up, there will be a time in which there will be a scientist for every man, every woman, every child, and every dog. And we were witnessing an explosion of the size of the scientific community. And that is exactly what has happened in the origins of life. Many of us were lucky to live exactly in the transition between this small group of researchers engaged with the study of the origins of life and this explosion in which we have a huge number of people devoted to the field, which may be good and may not necessarily be good. Now, I'm convinced that the study of the origins of life really begins really begins begins to take shape with the publication in 1859 of The Origin of a Species, because like Lamarck before him, Darwin rarely addressed the issue of the origins of life, but clearly provided a framework, an evolutionary framework, with the idea, especially in Darwin's case, of a single origin of life from which all the extant species are derived. And clearly, even though he did not explicitly speak or write about the origins of life, he was assuming the possibility of natural selection on the one hand. He was assuming the idea of a single origins of life, and he was assuming a very slow development of the first living entities. Now, one major scholar, 19th century scholar that became aware of this absence of the discussion of the origins of life was precisely Haeckel, who wrote, and he did it in acknowledging the debt that he had with Darwin. He said that the main problem of the origins of the Darwinian theory is that it was not providing any information on the origin of the primitive organisms, most likely a simple cell from which all the other species are descendant. And he explicitly said that when Darwin spoke about a special creation of a creative act for the first species, he was not being coherent, and Haeckel underlined, he was probably not being altogether sincere. Now, with Haeckel, some of the defining traits of what will be the study of the origins of life for the next 50 or 60 years actually took place. Haeckel was absolutely convinced, with very little empirical observation, that the cell nucleus was the above of heredity. And he explicitly wrote that accordingly, in as much as we are able to regard the plasma, what people will then call eventually protoplasma, as chiefly as the nutritive component of the cell, and on the other hand, as the reproductive component, we are justified in regarding the nucleus as the principal organ of inheritance and the protoplasma as the principal organ of adaptation, of metabolism, we will say today. In the case of the cytosol, and for Haeckel, cytosol was one of the names that he gave to bacteria, to the Monera, where the nucleus and plasma are not differentiated, we have to regard the entire plasma as a common organ having both functions, being able to be engaged both in heredity and in metabolism. And in fact, Haeckel assumed on the origins of life that you could divide all living organisms in plants, animals, and microbes, specifically protists, that included Monera, that included bacteria, that he was assuming were the oldest kingdom. He was assuming that, as I already mentioned, that the cell nucleus was the place where heredity resided, but in Monera, both heredity and nutrition and metabolism resided on the protoplasm. And based on his idea of the unity of nature, he proposed a general scheme of evolution according to which life evolved spontaneously. Now, Haeckel wrote a beautiful piece, a beautiful paragraph in his last book published at the turn of the 20th century, in which he said that the chemical elements that we find in living organisms are the same that we find in the inorganic world. Organic life is in itself merely a physical chemical process based on metabolism or exchange of material of these albuminates. Albuminates was the term he was using for proteins. And these protoplasmic compounds of carbon can be distinguished from most of the other combinations of chemistry by their very, very complex and molecular structure, their instability, and their gelatinous consistence. And I think this is an extraordinary paragraph in which you can see actually a very, very clear manifesto, a materialistic manifesto. Now, one can view, when one reads the riddle of the universe, of the history of creation by Haeckel, it's perfectly clear that Haeckel, I'm having some problems. Let me do something very quickly. Okay, so Haeckel was actually the first to provide the idea of the cosmic evolution. Everybody recognizes the role of the colleagues like Carl Sagan as proposing this idea of a cosmic evolution that starts within the universe and goes on up to the origins of life. But it was really Haeckel the first who assumed, following Kant, which he specifically quotes, that the Earth was formed from a nebula, that recognizing that protoplasm is extremely rich in water, he assumed that life could not appear on Earth until we have the condensation of the hydrosphere. Then he assumed the spontaneous generation of life, a major gap in this general scheme. And from there, he went on to assume, okay, we will have the three major kingdoms, the idea of the animals, plants, and protista as the three major kingdoms. But keep in mind that for Haeckel, spontaneous generation was the sole mechanism that could account for the presence of life on Earth. Now, going back to what I mentioned, Darwin rarely discussed the origins of life, but he clearly provided a framework, an evolutionary framework of descendants from which one could assume that evolutionary changes took place slowly due to natural selection. But what many people tend to forget is that by the end of the 19th century, many people accepted the idea of evolution, but the idea of natural selection was increasingly rejected. And this gave rise to a number of propositions of alternative to Darwinism to try to explain the diversity of life. And this was the idea of orthogenesis, that was main, as some people have said, is the Anglo-Saxon version of Lamarckism. The idea of symbiosis, which was developed mostly in the Russian Empire, and mutationism, which was the natural outcome, of course, of the rediscovery, if you wish, of Mendel's work. And it is hard for us to realize how the extraordinary influence, truly extraordinary influence, that the discovery of Mendel's work had, not only in not only in biology, in life sciences, but in general. And in particular, in 1915, it's me who added the date here, Morgan, Sturtevant, Müller, and Bridges came up with this small volume called The Mechanism of Mendelian Heredity, which was extraordinarily influential, mostly in the Western countries. And I will come to this later on. And Morgan, who really didn't care about the origins of life, was, of course, the founder of the so-called flight room in the University of Columbia, in which he proposed the use of Drosophila as a model to study genetics. Well, one of these authors, Müller, who was very, very keen on the origins of life, on evolution, actually came out, based on the idea of Mendel, came out with the idea that life had emerged when a single gene emerged by chance on the primitive oceans. And for Müller, the first living being, the first living entity was nothing but a single gene that emerged by pure chance. In other words, he was giving an ontological role to chance for explaining the origins of life. And for Mueller, this primordial gene was already endowed with autocatalysis. It could replicate. With heterocatalysis, it could actually affect its surroundings, and from here eventually metabolism will emerge, and it could change, it could mutate. That for Mueller and for all the mutationists of the early 20th century was the main condition for evolution. In other words, for Mueller, evolution could only be explained by mutation, or as one could say today, Mueller was an evolutionist, but he was not a Darwinian evolutionist. And in fact, the work of Mueller, that was almost contemporary to the first papers by Opary, reflects what was a major debate that we tend to forget. Following the rediscovery of the works of Mendel, genetic mutations were assumed the first source of evolutionary nobilities, in opposition, always in opposition to the ideas of Darwin. And this led to very strong ideological arguments, especially in Russia. And I will come back to that in a second. Why in Russia? Because when the first translation of The Origin of a Species was published in 1864 in Russia, as happened in many other countries, Darwin's idea was received with extraordinary enthusiasm by the most open-minded, liberal, left-inclined political sectors of society. And in the Russian case, this was reflected very clearly. Of course, it was reflected by Marx and Engels and so on. But in the Russian case specifically, it was Darwin became truly a major inspiration for people like Kropotkin, Plejano, and Lenin himself, who declared sometimes in 1922 or so that Darwinism must be part of the ideological component of the new Soviet state. Now, in the Russian and Soviet case, one has to keep in mind that when the publication of Darwinism, of Darwin's ideas took place in Russia, very quickly, a number of very conservative thinkers like Strahov, Merchevsky, and Danielewski, who was a very strong defender of monarchism of the Russian crown, immediately started a campaign against Darwin's idea. And this rapidly placed the debate between Mendel and Darwin in an ideological context, and the rediscovery of Darwin's ideas and the role of mutation was seen by many of the leftists and many of the scientists as an attack against Darwinism. And this led, for instance, Timiryazev, who was the major proponent of Darwinism in the Russian Empire, to declare that Mendelists and mutationists were the major enemy in the struggle against anti-Darwinism. So you can see how very strongly the ideological debate took place, opposing, on the one hand, Darwinism, that was considered a battle cry of the left, against Darwinism, against mutationism, that were considered the representatives of the right wing of the conservatives. Now, Timiryazev was truly a major figure in the development of Darwinism in Russia. And in particular, I think one can say quite clearly that Darwinism became the battle cry of the left. And there is a a very interesting paper written by Timiryazev in 1912, in which he actually speaks about the struggle against Mendelism. Timiryazev, as I already mentioned, was a rather powerful figure, very influential figure, not only in the scientific environment, but also in the political context in the Russian Empire. And eventually, when the Bolshevik revolution took place, he published a book that is very, very indicative of this complex situation. In 1920, the book was published. It's called Science and Democracy. And just look at the frontispiece of the book that is very revealing. You can see here an spectrophotometer of the time with the hammer and the sickle indicating this alliance between science and the Bolsheviks. And here is a letter that you can find. There are several of them that you can find in the web, which is quite difficult to read. A manuscript letter by Lenin himself, who had a tremendous admiration for Timiryazev. And now this period is a very complex period, and many people think that the Soviets, the regime, that the Bolsheviks tried to destroy the scientific apparatus. That was not really the case. When you look at all the actions they took, they decided instead to ideologize the previous the scientific community. And there is a very, very good book by Lauren Graham called The Soviet Academy of Sciences and the Communist Party, in which he speaks about this attempt by people like Bukharin and Hessen and others to actually dominate the Academy of Sciences until at least they decided to leave it alone, but with an ideological control. But what is absolutely fascinating is the extraordinary investment that the Soviet government made in science and in technology. It was quite amazing, the amount of energy, of the social investment, the economical resources that pour into science. And don't forget that Lenin at some point said that communism is socialism plus electricity. You need it from this perspective to have a very strong technological infrastructure. And this is actually a view of Leninsky Prospect, where many buildings devoted to science were constructed. And in particular, this large building that you can see over here was the Bach Institute, where biochemistry was developed, and that was actually directed by Oparin for many years following the death of Bach. So just to make a brief chronology, which I think is very useful, in 1917, precisely the year of the when the Bolsheviks overtook the government, the Institute of Experimental Biology by Koltsov was founded. A few years later, and following the lecture of the reading of La Nouvelle Terre, the Harwood, that had been translated by Timiryazev again, Lenin decided to introduce many species into the Soviet agriculture. And this required, of course, an investment in science and biology and agriculture. In 1924, Vavilov created the Institute of Applied Botany that eventually became the Lenin Academy of Agricultural Sciences. And at the University of Leningrad, former St. Petersburg, the Department of Genetics was created, and it was very quickly joined by Chetnikov and Serebrovsky. Serebrovsky, who was basically the professor of Dobzhansky and other famous geneticists that eventually emigrated to the West. But in 1927, the so-called Communist Academy of Sciences, there was a very short-lived group, precisely described by my friend Lauren Graham, decided that the acquired genetic traits should be studied. And some of the members of the Communist Academy actually say that it was the only possible Marxist approach that could be developed. Now, it is precisely in this context that two major figures of by now Soviet biology can be recognized. Bach, who was also a friend of Lenin, who was the founder of Russian and later Soviet biochemistry, and Timiryazev, whom we have spoken about him, who was a major promoter of Darwinism. Now, Bach had undertaken some studies actually in France, in Paris, and of course in Germany, as was typical of many of the Soviet and Russian scientists of the time. And Timiryazev was a lecturer in the University of Moscow, in the Imperial University. But in 1911, he left the university as a protest against the repression against students by the Ministry of Education, CASO. Those of you that have read, I forget the name in this moment, this famous novel, the name will come to me in a second. May be reminded of this repression in the movies and in the novels. And Timiryazev nevertheless continued to have meetings every week, every Wednesday in his apartment in Moscow, where he convened a number of colleagues that had also left the university and some students, so they could speak about Darwinism. They could discuss Darwin's work, Darwin's methodology. And it is precisely following the attendance of Alexander Ivanovich Oparin to one of these lectures that he approached Timiryazev and asked him to talk to him about Darwinism. Timiryazev invited him when he was an undergraduate to the meetings, the weekly meetings that he had in his apartment. And at the time, Oparin was already working with Bach at the university as a biochemical student. So by the time Oparin ended his studies at the university, he was extremely well versed in the main trends of biochemistry of the time, but he was also, and this is quite unique, he was also very, very familiar, not only with the literature of Darwin, but also on the Darwinian methodology to analyze scientific issues. We're speaking of very complicated years. It was the First World War. Russia was engaged in the war against Germany, against Prussia, and so on. And in fact, many of the medications, many of the pharmacological products came to Russia from Germany. And of course, with the war, this was stopped. So Oparin, like many of his colleagues, and you can see him in this photograph that is quite well known, got involved in the production of medicines in the Russian Empire. And this is a photograph that some of you may have seen, or it's quite well known, in which he is with the union of pharmaceutical workers and very, very much involved in the creation of the first Soviet aspirin. Oparin used to tell me as a joke that he was involved in the creation of the first aspirin, but he's always said, but the main problem was that the aspirin was the size of an old rubble, so it was a little bit difficult to use it if you were ill. Now, Oparin was engaged in this work, practical work, was continuing his studies with Bach at the university, and was attending the seminars with Timiryazev at the time in which many people believed that the first living entities had to be autotrophic, had to be photosynthetic. And this is precisely where Oparin broke apart from the trend of the time. This is the only surviving photograph that we know of. And when I say we, I'm speaking about myself and my Russian colleagues that we know of Oparin at the time. And he has, of course, the uniform of a cadet, a student, but note the way that he has cut his hair. This was typical. It was a trend, hallmark of all the youngsters who were following the Bolsheviks. Oparin never joined the Communist Party, but he was certainly very, very close to the to the Bolsheviks at the time. And the story is well known that in November 1923, he's published the first edition of his book that was called The Origins of Life. And I will come to this in a moment. Now, what is the main thesis? What is the main argument that Oparin made? Well, at the time, as I already mentioned, the people were convinced that you had only two main types of metabolism. On the one hand, you had fermentation, heterotrophy. You require previously formed organic compounds to develop, or you could be photosynthetic, a photosynthetic organism, and in this case was autotrophy is the name we give to this. Now, Oparin was very much aware, and I think this is fascinating, was very much aware that in order to have a photosynthetic metabolism, you have to be endowed with pigments, the different types of chlorophyll, you require membranes, you require a number of oxidation reduction reactions, you need a number of cofactors, and from an evolutionary perspective that Oparin was very familiar with, it was almost impossible to assume that the first living entities were already endowed with this complex set of structures and biochemicals. So he rapidly concluded that no, autotrophy could not be the first metabolism found in the first living entities, and he therefore assumed that it was heterotrophy what defined the mode of metabolism of the first living entities. Now, if you're going to be heterotrophic, you clearly require organic compounds, and like many people, you can cut a banana, and of course, you know that organic compounds are very rapidly destroyed in the presence of oxygen. So Oparin concluded that you want to preserve these organic compounds, you clearly need to be in an atmosphere that doesn't have oxygen. So from here, from his observations or his analysis of biochemical pathways, Oparin concludes that the primitive atmosphere, that the atmosphere had to be anoxic. And from here, he very rapidly proposes a scheme that tries to explain the origins of life from an heterotrophic perspective. The first living entities had to be very simple, and following Darwin, he assumed they were heterotrophic. If you are going to be heterotrophic, you need organic compounds, and the only way you can have organic compounds is if you preserve, it's only if you have an atmosphere that is lacking oxygen. Now, from where did Oparin construct this sequence, which is absolutely fascinating? In contrast to many biologists of the time, he was quite willing to speak with the astronomers and the planetologists that were known to him, and they confirmed to him that hydrogen is the most abundant component in the universe, the most abundant chemical element of the universe. So for him, this provided a strong argument to assume that the primitive Earth had an atmosphere that was lacking free oxygen. Then he looked especially the work of Mendeleev, the work of Butlerov on the synthesis of abiotic synthesis of sugars, of hydrocarbons. Apparently, he was not familiar with the work of Strecker at the time, who had demonstrated over 50 years previously that alanine can be synthesized under laboratory conditions. He was not aware of the work of Jacques Proust that had demonstrated that hydrogen cyanide can polymerize and give a number of compounds, of organic compounds. But Oparin, based on the chemistry, 19th century chemistry, decided that you could synthesize organic compounds, of course, always in a medium that is lacking oxygen. And then, because he was assuming that bacteria, that Monera, remember that he, and that this was the trend of the time, because he was assuming that bacteria were the oldest kingdom. He assumed that both metabolism and genetics and heredity resided in the protoplasma. And what was the best available model for him to assume something that preceded the protoplasma, well, gels and droplets of organic material. Well, he published the book, so now you can see perfectly clearly what were the major influences. Like all Russian scientists of the time, Haeckel was a major influence for them. Remember that the connections between German culture, German science, and Russian culture, later Soviet science, were in fact quite strong. He assumed from a Darwinian perspective the idea that the first living entities were simply heterotrophic bacteria. If they were bacteria, they were monera, as Haeckel say. Therefore, they had to have in the protoplasm both the heredity and metabolism. There was no way he could escape out of this. And if you are heterotrophic, then clearly you need previously the accumulation of organic compounds. He used the experiments in the 19th century to underline this step in his process. And if you have to have organic compounds, that clearly you need an anoxic atmosphere. So from here, Oparin provides a whole scheme on the origins of life that was really the basis of the book that he published in November 1923. Although, as he always say, well, the date that appears on the front page is 1924. Now, Oparin had actually given a lecture on his idea on the Botanical Society, the Moscow section of the Botanical Society. Here he gave his lecture presenting his scheme. Several times he told me that he was enthusiastically received by the people there. But once I spoke with a former student of Oparin, who was a young scientist, attended the meeting. And when I asked him about the reception of Oparin's idea in 1922, he said in a very dry way, only the students applauded him. The rest of the people did not. The book is absolutely fascinating. It's called already The Origins of Life, as I mentioned. It was published not by a scientific editorial, by a scientific publisher. It was published by publisher named Moskovsky Rabochi, the Moscow Worker. And up here you can see the famous ending lines of the manifesto, the Communist Manifesto, workers of the world unite. As a Mexican, it's very easy for me to understand why the book has this kind of presentation. Following the revolution in 1910, of course, there was a major effort in Mexico to develop politics of outreach of science, of art, and so on for the working class. So it was exactly the same in the Soviet Union, and it happens all the time. The editorial, the activity was quite intense at the time. And the only thing that Oparin always told me with his tongue in the cheek is that he could never understand why a mitotic cell had been included in the frontispiece of his work, since he was assuming that in fact it was bacteria and not cells not eukaryotes, we will call them today, that were actually present at the time. But in any case, what Oparin did clearly under the basis of Haeckel's idea was to complete the transition that for Haeckel was a spontaneous generation. Oparin assumed chemical and prebiological evolution with the conditions that I have already mentioned, and leading to heterotrophic primordial monera, primordial bacteria. Oparin very rarely acknowledged in his books the influence of Haeckel, but like all the Russians, all the Soviets of his generation, he had no problem in talking about this as was normal of the time. Now, is it surprising that Oparin's ideas did not include genes or nucleic acids? Well, people were not aware at the time of the role of DNA or RNA in genetic material. And one should never forget that Haeckel, who was a major influence in the work of Oparin, had assumed that monera lacked every trace of genetic substances found as in other organisms. And one can read all the work of Haeckel, and he's quite consistent about this. But even as late as 1942, Julian Huxley, whom we recognize as engaged in the is one of the architects of the Darwinian synthesis, said explicitly that bacteria have no genes in the sense of accurately quantized portions of hereditary substance, the idea that they were part of the protoplasm. Therefore, they have no need for the accurate division, that genetic divisions that we see in mitosis. Now, to summarize this briefly, how did Oparin support his proposal? Well, he assumed that there were organic compounds present in comets and meteorites. The work of Berzelius and others was quite well known at the time. He based his idea on the prebiotic soup on the chemical synthesis, abiotic chemical synthesis in the 19th century of organic compounds like urea, hydrocarbons, sugars, and so on. He adopted the idea of structures with a phase separation as models of precellular systems. He needed a physical chemical model to account for something that had come before protoplasm. And following, as I already mentioned, the universal distribution of fermentation and its simplicity, Oparin proposed glycolysis as the primordial metabolism. Now, when one reads the literature of the time, you find what I call the roaring 20s. Oparin brought and published his idea in 1923. Haldane eventually did something similar in 1929, but don't forget that Haldane, who was a geneticist, a major geneticist, is also one of the architects of the neo-Darwinian synthesis, actually say that life had remained in the stage of a virus for for a long time in the primitive soup until the virus eventually developed into a heterotrophic cell. Harvey, who was an American microbiologist, spoke about the possibility of having cells emerging in hydrothermal conditions, because as he said, if you have a hot environment, then chemical reactions will proceed more rapidly, and therefore you will not need many enzymes, but he left it there. And Liebman, who was a geochemist who worked at the University of California, already assumed briefly in this small essay that he published in 1925, he was assuming that already a heterotrophic origin of life. But of all these published works, the ones that I found more elaborate, more sophisticated, if you wish, are precisely the works of Oparin. Now, what I think is truly the major work of Oparin was not his 1924 book, but really the book that he published in 1936 that was rapidly translated in 1938. And this book is truly a masterpiece of Darwinian analysis. Here, Oparin not only explains and explores in detail the evidence assuming a reducing atmosphere. Of course, he was not the origin, the one who gave the name of the primitive soup. This comes from Haldane. I'm just using it here for simplicity. He reviews with a tremendous detail the available information of the synthesis of organic compounds. Like many people of the time, starting with, of course, Bundenberg de Jong in the Netherlands, he now left aside the idea of gels and droplets and assumed quasorbates as the structure that preceded protoplasm. But indeed, he continued with his idea of bacteria that were heterotrophic and anaerobic as the first forms of life. If you read this book carefully, there is also a fascinating philosophical analysis on the history of the ideas on the origins of life. And something that many people do not realize is that Oparin actually provided phylogeny based on the evolution of metabolism of prokaryotes of bacteria. He never used the term prokaryotes. That came into use much later, starting from heterotrophic bacteria. So for Oparin, you could not disconnect the origins of life from the later evolution of microbes, and the origins of life was indeed the sequence of events that I have described here. Now, if you read the book, once again, genes are missing, but this is not surprising. He never speaks of genes, but one should not forget that at the time, 1936 is the time that he published the book. At the time, people were not aware of what genes were. In 1919, Morgan, this extraordinary promoter of Mendelism in the West and eventually all over the world, wasn't convinced that genes were something that you could actually touch or analyze. As he said in 1919, genes may be a chemical molecule or a fluctuating quantity of something. This comes from the founder of Mendelian genetics in the West. And then when he received the Nobel Award in 1933, you can actually read the Nobel lecture. You can find it in the web without any problem. He says, there is no consensus among geneticists as to what genes are, whether they are real or purely fictitious. The people really had no idea of what the genes were, although in 1926, Mueller, who was at Morgan's lab, demonstrated that genes could be affected by X-rays and therefore were real entities. But many people did not accept this. And don't forget that in the 1936, when Oparin published his idea, the Darwinian neo-Darwinian synthesis was starting to develop. Many people were not truly convinced that, first of all, they did not know that you could reconcile Mendelian genetics with the idea of natural selection. And in fact, this major achievement was hardly known in many ways. It was hardly known in the Soviet Union because don't forget that the Soviet Union suffered the isolation from Western countries because of the Soviet Revolution. And don't forget also that there was this trend for Lamarck and not and against Mendelism. Now, one point that one should never forget is that at the time, also for many people in the West and in the Soviet Union, genetics was associated with eugenics, namely with the idea of selecting in human population genetic traits that could be used to make better humans. So clearly, in the atmosphere prior to the Second World War, the eugenetic tendencies of many geneticists became more and more visible. Fisher, for instance, who was one of the founders of the neo-Darwinian synthesis because of his work, was actually engaged in eugenesis mechanisms. So I think that is it surprising that that Oparin's ideas did not include genes or nucleic acids? Well, don't forget that Darwin came from his intellectual scientific roots came from the Darwinian explanation of evolution. They were opposed to the Mendelian perspective. At the time, nobody was really thinking of putting these things together. That for many, genetics was identified by many as associated with eugenism, with eugenics, and that Oparin was very close to Lysenko, who rejected Mendelism and Western genetics. One point that one has to keep in mind is that Hermann Müller, who had moved to the Soviet Union, he was really never a member of the American Communist Party, but he was very close to them. He moved to the Soviet Union and he wrote a letter that you can find in his biographies, in which he proposed to the development of an eugenic program, a Soviet, a communist eugenic program. So as he wrote, we could have men and women with the brains and the brightness of mind of individuals like Madame Curie, like Beethoven, or like Einstein. So, and here we're talking of someone who was a leftist. It's something that people tend not to speak about too much or have not been studied sufficiently. But in any case, by 1936, Oparin's heterotrophic ideas had, first of all, located clearly, they had set the question of the origins of life in a Darwinian framework. And I think this was a major achievement, had proposed a multi and interdisciplinary research program. You had to know astronomy, planetology, chemistry, physical chemistry, microbiology, biochemistry, and so on. He had reinterpreted many isolated facts and observations in an evolutionary sequence that would lead to the first organism. He had interpreted for the first time, as far as I'm aware, many chemical information and phenomena in an evolutionary context. He separated the idea of a spontaneous generation of organisms from the chemical and biochemical origins of life, and always based on pre-Mendelian genetics. He rejected the idea of a living molecule and instead suggested life as a property of systems of molecules. And not surprisingly, it is my dear friend Michel Morange who has actually elaborated more on this point than many others. So if one makes a comparison between Hermann Müller and Oparin, including his 1924 and 1936 work, for Müller, you have non-living matter, and all of a sudden, due to chance, you have the transition to a primordial gene. All life is reduced to a single gene, to a single substance, and you have the ontological role of chance here. And for Oparin, you have, instead of a process in which you start with the synthesis and accumulation of organic monomers, you then go to precellular systems like Wasserbeck. From here, you develop a primordial metabolism, and you have a heterotrophic, anaerobic heterotrophic fermentation as the defining trait, the defining metabolic trait of the first living entities. Now, Oparin published his books in 1936 in the Soviet Union. It was a very harsh period where the repression of Stalin, again, a number of scientists like geologists, was harsh, terrible, beyond belief. In 1938, the book was translated into English, but as Harold Urey once told me, and as Albert Eschenmoser once mentioned to me, one could read the book at the time if you were a student or a scientist, but everybody was becoming engaged in the war effort of the Second World War. When the book was published in 1938, already the Second World War had started with the Spanish Civil War. So really people paid little or attention or did very little work on the origins of life. It was not until after the war when, as all of you know, in 1952, Harold Urey published his ideas on the reducing character of the primordial atmosphere. Urey, by the time had left the Manhattan Project, was already part of the faculty of the University of Chicago, the Department of Chemistry. And his argument for assuming a primordial atmosphere was extremely elegant. He said that if the Earth had formed together with the rest of the solar system from a solar nebula, therefore the primitive Earth should have a chemical composition resembling the solar nebula that had to resemble in turn the composition of the universe. And then he proposed, this equation is not properly balanced, but it doesn't matter. He proposed an atmosphere with methane, ammonia, water, hydrogen sulfide, and very little, if any, CO2. Urey published his idea in a paper, classical paper, in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, then gave a seminar at the University of Chicago, And sitting in that seminar room, where in the first line, in the first row, was Carl Sagan, of course. And in the very back, because he was always very shy, was Stanley Miller, who had just joined the University of Chicago as a graduate student. And both Carl Sagan and Stanley Miller told me exactly the same story, that when Urey ended his seminar, somebody got up and said, this is a very interesting proposal. Are you aware of the suggestion of a Russian, they never said a Soviet, but a Russian scientist operating who assumes that in this kind of environment, life appears? Urey said, no, I was not aware, but it will be interesting to try to do some experiments. And then eventually the lecture stopped. Well, after a few weeks, a couple of months, Stanley Miller, who was until then a graduate student of Edward Teller, was left without an advisor because Edward Teller went to the Alamos to develop the H-bomb, the hydrogen bomb. So he decided to approach Harold Urey to see if he could make his thesis precisely working on this issue. And at first, and a number of you know the story quite well, Urey was very reluctant to give the project to Stanley Miller. Finally, he accepted on the condition that he could work for only 6 months on it, and if it didn't work, then he will have to change the project. Well, Stanley Miller engaged very rapidly in designing the experiment, but at the time when Stanley Miller did his experiments, one has to keep in mind that what was the intellectual, the scientific environment. Living beings were thought to be divided in the three Hegelian big kingdoms: plants, animals, and microbes. Many people believe that the oldest traces of life were only 600 million years old, and that the Earth had remained as sterile without life for many, many million years. The emergence of the biosphere was thought by many to be a process that required millions and millions or billions of years. Many people believe that proteins did play a major role in the continuity of genetic information. The formation of solar system was seen to be something rare, and the space exploration was thought by many to be a very simple, a very unlikely thing to happen. Now, we're talking about the 1950s in the United States, where you have this horrible atmosphere of McCarthyism. And the books that play the key role in Stanley Miller's ideas on the origins of life was, of course, Oparin, a Soviet scientist, The Physical Basis of Life by John D. Bernal, a staunch communist Irish British scientist, and Harold Urey, who was never a communist, who was never a socialist, but he was a very decent man who had opposed, for instance, the repression against the Rosenberg couple, the Rosenberg family, who had been accused of spying for the Soviets. I have to confess that it did not light upon me until several years after Stanley Miller had died what kind of reactions Stanley Miller had from the most conservative parts of American scientific environments, because he was clearly basing his work on evolution, and the United States is a society that we all know well is not very keen on Darwinian ideas, and at the same time he was basing his work precisely on this proposal by people that were seen as not exactly very who were too leftist for the society of the time. Let me put it this way. Well, in any case, Stanley did the experiment. As you know well, the experiment demonstrated this photograph come from William Schopf's replication of the experiment. In few hours, you can have the synthesis of organic compounds. And don't forget that the experiment was published in 1953. There was an extraordinary harvest, scientifically speaking. It was the year in which also Watson and Crick published the model of the DNA double helix. So from now on, anything you do on the origins of life has to be consistent with what we know as are the subcellular processes that define life. The Miller experiment was rapidly recognized by the Soviets as a key advancement in the development of the origins of life. Oparin actually himself promoted the experiment as much as possible. It comes from general journal for the public, for the general public outreach, vulgarisation, as you say in French, in 1958. And Oparin very quickly recognized the significance of the experiments, although at first he was not very keen. He thought it was natural to have the organic compounds. Now, during the 20 years that follow the 1952 experiment of Stanley Miller, the attempts to understand the origins of life were defined scientifically by the fact that since the late 1940s, evolutionary biology became an established field of research. The origins of life was not dismissed anymore as a pure speculation without any significance. It was, if you have a field, if you have journals and chairs and departments of evolutionary biology, clearly the question of the origins of life becomes important. It was defined by the unraveling of the details of DNA replication and protein biosynthesis and by the development of the space program. Without NASA, it has to be said quite openly, the field would have not acquired the solidity and had not gained the ground it has. But in social-political terms, the origins of life was defined by the atmosphere that were created by the Cold War. Now, let us examine first the scientific developments. In 1961, Joan Oró, a friend of many of us here, actually demonstrated that from hydrogen cyanide, which is a molecule that we found in comets, we found in the stellar medium, we found that is formed in the Miller experiment that was very likely present on the primitive Earth, and you could synthesize adenine. The problem was defined later on by the work of Jim Ferris and Leslie Orgel. But the main point is that now you have the formation of a component of DNA, of RNA in the primitive oceans. So this actually, the significance of the work is not only the demonstration, the beautiful demonstration that you can synthesize adenine, but also that you can synthesize the components of nucleic acids under primitive condition, and hence begin the concordance, the coming together of molecular biology and the origins of life field. And this rapidly influenced the work of Hermann Müller, who had assumed that, you may remember, in 1926, that he was assuming that life started with a primordial catalytic and autocatalytic and endowed with mutability gene, to actually assume in 1959 that in fact life had appeared when a single DNA molecule appeared by chance in the primitive oceans. I have to say that and this is fascinating, someone sent a copy of the DNA double helix paper to Hermann Müller, who was moving to Hawaii for a sabbatical year, and he did not look at the paper after like 2 years or so, which is absolutely surprising. But when he realized the significance of the work, he very rapidly adapted his ideas to speak about the origins of life. So one could say that for Müller, the origins of life was the quick transition due by chance from non-living matter into primordial DNA. And for Oparin, still it was the emergence of the heterotrophic bacteria by this evolutionary process. Now, Müller had been in the Soviet Union. He has a fascinating biography. He was expelled basically from the Soviet Union. That actually is something that saved his life. He then went to fight in the Spanish Civil War, and then from there he was in a diaspora for some time until he finally ended in the United States. And when he got the Nobel Award, he was recognized as a major figure in genetics. But he never accepted Oparin's view, based basically on his anti-Soviet stance. In 1961, Hermann Müller brought that the suggestion based on Haeckel, of course, that protoplasm had originated first and had the ability, the capability of manufacturing not only the genetic material, but also its own complex organization. It's been proposed by Oparin, the Russian Oparin, since 1930s, who espoused this view because he was following the line of the Communist Party by giving genetic material a backseat. They were not really important. And so here you have this very, very painful period, this very complicated situation. And I have to say that this issue was analyzed by Rudy Falk, who was the last postdoc that Hermann Müller had or was a scientist in Israel, and myself. And I think we provided in this paper to a meeting that I was invited by Michel Morange. I think we provide a fair description of the debate. By then also, Oparin had decided to organize a meeting on the origins of life. And he rapidly wrote to Stanley Miller, who was at the time a postdoc in Caltech. The letters I will show from here onwards are all in the Miller archives and in the Urey archives in the University of California, San Diego campus. And Oparin invited Stanley Miller. It's still we're still speaking of the McCarthy era, invited him to go to Moscow to the August 1957 meeting and present his a paper on his work. And Stanley really did not know what to do. He also invited Urey, but Stanley, being a postdoc, not having money, 1957, 1956, 1957, did not know how to do, so he wrote to Harold Urey. And the answer from Harold Urey is actually found again in the archives of Harold Urey. This is a copy that comes from there. And let me transcribe this paragraph for you. In which I think is very dramatic. Harold Urey says to Stanley Miller, I don't know how to advise you. I think that everybody has take his own decision, must have his own opinion on this subject. The nuclear scientists and their associates went some time ago to the Soviet Union. And if they let in the United States go the Soviet Union without being stigmatized, I think that innocent people like us could also go there, but what one never knows what McCarthy would do in the future. Is a very sad situation. The letter is very dramatic. One should never forget that indeed there was McCarthy, but a few years ago we had Mr. Trump in the United States. But I think that the most dramatic line is this one: the innocent people like us can also go. Well, Stanley decided that he wanted to go to the Soviet Union, but then he had to write to the National Science Foundation asking for support for the trip, and the National Science Foundation sent immediately the Stanley request to the Department of State, and from the Department of State, Stanley Miller he requested the money, and he got this answer from the United States Atomic Energy Commission that say that, well, okay, you can go, but you must report any significant changes in your itinerary. You cannot display any restricted information from the United States to people that are not authorized. And you have to report by us when you come back to the United States, to say either by phone or by mail. Well, Stanley Miller went there, and when he got back to the United States, he told the story to several of us that he was visited by probably members of the FBI or the CIA. And Stanley had a very dry sense of humor, as some of you know, and have actually enjoyed. So when they asked him what was the atmosphere in the meeting, Stanley said, oh, it was quite oxidant, you see. We have oxygen in the atmosphere, and it was very, very hot indeed. So he managed somehow to avoid compromising himself with the G-men, as they say in English, and never said, well, he had nothing secret to reveal. But what is fascinating is what happened at the meeting. The meeting took place in August. The proceedings were eventually published in a book edited by Oparin and some of his associates. And few months later, the Sputnik was launched. No one, and I have spoken with a number of people that attended the meeting, there was absolutely no indication that the Soviet Union was about to launch the first satellite. So it was really kept in absolute secret. And this, in fact, actually opened a whole new perspective for the origins of life. Before I touch that issue, let me mention that in this book, you can read the rebuttal that Olga Vasilieva Lepeshinskaya, who was a very close associate of Lysenko, who had been a very close friend of Stalin, presented a manuscript in the meeting, and she said that we fully share the view of Oparin that the origin of life was associated with the evolution of multicellular organic systems in the form of quaterbates. We cannot, however, agree with the other suggestion of Oparin that the forms of life similar to those, the original one, cannot actually exist under natural conditions at the time. This valuable exchange of ideas lead us to closer to the conclusion that the material of life is protein, which can develop and determine development. And then we remember again with gratitude, the thankfulness, the words of Frederick Engels: life is the mode of existence of albuminous bodies. I think it's very revealing how as late as 1957, actually as late as now, you should read some books published in Cuba and in China on the nature of life. Engels remains as the overwhelming figure for some old communists of the time. And Oparin answered back, not in the meeting, but answered these statements by Lepeshinskaya in a book that he published by with Fesenkov, a well-known Soviet astronomer. And he said, yes, of course, forms of life similar to the original ones can exist under natural conditions at the present time, but not on the Earth, because life has changed the terrestrial environment. The processes that lead to the origins of life are constantly taking place, but in other parts of the universe. In other words, what Oparin was saying that what gave origin to life on Earth must be taking place elsewhere. And this, in fact, is one of the bases of the current attempts to look for life elsewhere in the universe. But what is also fascinating is what the meetings that were organized after in following the Miller experiment. In 1953, in a very little known volume that was published by Penguin Press, the Society for Experimental Biology met in Cambridge. Then in 1955, the Brooklyn Polytechnic organized another meeting, and this was published in the Annals of the New York Academy of Sciences, as was a later meeting published by the New York Academy of Sciences in 1956. In 1957, the first international conference took place in Moscow, and from 1960 onwards, you can start seeing meetings in which planetologists, astronomers, chemists, origins of life people come together and start discussing the possibility of life elsewhere in the universe. Well, following the meeting in Moscow, I have to say that in contrast to what some people say, Oparin accepted, and they are in this book, he accepted the idea from 1956 onwards that the double helix model of DNA, he accepted without any problem the idea that proteins were encoded by nucleic acid. But he always, he accepted, of course, the role that was being known by at the time that different kinds of RNA molecules actually are involved in the synthesis of proteins. But until the very last paper that he wrote in 1972, he absolutely refused to accept the idea that life depended on one single molecule. So if one looks at the history of the hypothesis of the RNA world that is so popular nowadays, that in one way or the other has influenced how we define the field, we have this extraordinary, truly amazing set of work in the 19th century by chemists like Buehler, Butler of Strecker, synthesizing urea, alanine, sugars, and so on. By the turn of the 20th century, people thought that this would explain the process of photosynthesis in plants. But what I found fascinating is that especially Oparin and Haldane reinterpreted all this information to assume there was a primitive heterotrophic origins of life and synthesis like these were taking place on the primitive Earth. And this, of course, led to increasingly sophisticated versions of the heterotrophic origins of life. With the Miller experiment, this was shown to be possible, as many people interpreted at the time, under primitive conditions. And with the synthesis of adenine, you indeed have this demonstration that the origins of life studies were not in contradiction with the rapidly developed molecular biology until, of course, we come to the idea of the RNA world concept. So what is the current situation? Well, I think that Oparin's theory is what my friends who work in the epistemology of science define as an open theory. Oparin assumes a reducing atmosphere, the synthesis of organic compounds, the presence of quaterbates. Now we know, I think, in detail what were the major influences behind these ideas, and he assumed heterotrophic bacteria. And nowadays, I think it's fair to say that we are quite open about the origin and accumulation of organic compounds in the primitive Earth. Clearly, there must have been some contribution from extraterrestrial sources, as shown by the craters seen in all the solar system. Clearly, something equivalent took place in the primitive Earth. We really do not know how to go from there from the RNA world. The RNA world may have not been a very pure environment. Probably it included the oxyribonucleotides, amino acids, many other compounds. I think that we really have the obligation to avoid reductionist descriptions of the RNA world. But then on the other hand, the work of people like Ada Jonath and other crystallographers has demonstrated that in the ribosome, we don't see catalytic proteins in the we don't see proteins in the catalytic site of the ribosome. So hence, the protein synthesis must have evolved with RNA playing a key role. And from here onwards, we can more or less try to understand that we came to an RNA protein world, and that DNA is very likely a latecomer as a genetic molecule in the process of the origins of life. And this is basically what I wanted to share with you all.
Okay, thank you very much, Antonio. It was a fantastic, fantastic talk and interesting talk. So I can see that there are some hands rising to ask questions. So don't hesitate to either raise your hand or ask question in the chat. And if you raise your hand, I will give you the floor to ask the question. And if you write it in the chat, I will read it for you. So let's start maybe with Puri.
Thank you, Hervé. Thank you, Antonio. Gracias for this interesting talk, very historical. So I have a question about, so oparin equals somehow autotrophy with photosynthesis. So organisms that are able to fix carbon using light, and that was complex to him. But what about chemosynthesis? Maybe not early when we, perhaps that was less known, but by the 1950s and 60s, many organisms were known to be autotrophs, but not depending on photosynthesis. Did he ever say anything about that? Because models on the origin of life based on, for instance, hydrothermal vents that propose an autotrophic lifestyle since the beginning don't call for photosynthesis. So do you have any idea or any comment with respect to that?
Oh, absolutely. First of all, it's wonderful to see you, Puri. My best regards. It's good that the first question comes from you. It brings good luck to me. I'm delighted to see you. Qué bueno verte. Me da mucho gusto. Yes, actually, there were experiments done by a number of people. There were descriptions of chemosynthetic bacteria and by the turn of the 20th century. But don't forget that for oparin, the main guiding line was, the main guiding scheme was that of Haeckel. And Haeckel was not aware at all of chemosynthetic bacteria. And hence for oparin, the idea was if you were autotrophic, you had to be photosynthetic. There was no alternative for that. And but in the 1936 book, 1938 in English, he actually assumes that chemosynthetic bacteria came after fermentative bacteria and prior to photosynthesis. But for him, the first life forms were fermentative ones. That is in the last to the final chapter of his 1938 book. Now, one thing that has to be said is that I think that oparin's main contribution was to assume that life is the outcome of an evolutionary process of chemical synthesis, of abiotic chemical synthesis from different compounds that interact and so on. And for instance, his idea of fermentation was, like many people of the time, did not consider the possibility that fermentation, and we know this thanks to the work of Patricia Clark first and then of others, is in itself the outcome of a bricolage, a patchwork process of enzymes that come from different other processes. But at some point, Stanley Miller and I wrote a paper in which we said, among other things, that, well, one should think about heterotrophic simply implying that you capture the organic compounds that are already there, and from there you go on to develop a self-sustaining system. But yes, you're quite right in that.
Thank you.
Qué gusto. Un beso, saludos.
Mucho un beso. Gracias, hasta luego.
Alors, je vais prendre maintenant une question du chat qui avait été posée assez tôt concernant les volcans. Donc c'est une Ghislaine Feltin qui mentionne qu'elle pense qu'on s'intéresse aux volcans car ils présentent des environnements qui peuvent ressembler à ceux qui existaient au moment de la Terre primitive. Donc, est-ce que tu peux peut-être commenter là-dessus et peut-être, est-ce que Oparine ou Miller, au moment où ils ont commencé, je sais que Miller, à la fin, il pensait beaucoup, mais est-ce que au début de leurs travaux, il y avait déjà les volcans étaient dans le panorama? Voilà.
Yes, absolutely. First of all, there is one line that has always impressed me when you read Humboldt, that at some point says he has this extraordinary fascination with volcanoes, and he says they look so primordial. He had witnessed probably an earthquake or a small eruption somewhere, but he speaks of this primordial nature of the volcanoes. Oparin doesn't address the volcanoes directly, but the picture that we had, and reinforced in part by recent discoveries, is that indeed the geological activities was much more intense in the during the early stages of the Earth than today. Remember that hydrothermal vents were not described for the first time until the 1980s, I think, something of the sort. So no way they could be included in our descriptions or previous descriptions on the primitive Earth. On the other hand, Stanley Miller did address the issue of the role of volcanoes under the primitive Earth, and he never published the papers. He, together in the lab of Jeff Beda, who was Stanley Miller's second graduate student and a good friend of him, we actually reanalyzed some of the experiments that he did. Stanley left a very, very detailed written record of all the experiments that he performed. And Stanley actually designed a very simple model of his experiment with the primitive ocean represented by a flask with boiling water. And the vapor will come out at high pressure and mix with methane, ammonia, and hydrogen. And then he subjected that to electric discharges. Well, Stanley found, and we have the analysis, we repeated the analysis with modern techniques, and it can be seen that the diversity of compounds and the amount of compounds is much greater in the what we call the volcanic experiment than in the traditional spark experiment. Now, why did Stanley never publish that? Among other things, because some of the fellow students in the lab told him, Stanley, it's no way you could have volcanoes erupting in a primitive atmosphere. So it's driven mostly by peer pressure, I would say, of his friends and colleagues at the lab. He really never published the papers, but we did, and acknowledged, of course, that it was by Stanley who had did experiments and so on. There is an addition, Madame Feltan, je ne sais pas s'il y a des volcanoes in la Russie. Oui, absolument. Yes, of course. In Siberia, you have volcanic activities. And if you go to Kamchatka, Kamchatka has now become a major place to visit because of all the geological activities. Russia was so large, the Soviet Union was larger, of course, that it included all kinds of weather. The only thing it didn't have was tropical forest. And it had all kinds of geological settings and so on. In Kamchatka, you should please read the report that you can find in the web on the activity of Kamchatka, which is absolutely fascinating.
Okay, thank you very much. Alain, if you want to ask your question.
Yes, during the opposition between the Darwinism and the genetic approach, no one suggested that the gene themselves could have mutation and then and transmit the mutation and just enter the Darwin prospect.
Well, yes and no. Actually, the work of Morgan convinced many people that you could have not only the accumulation of mutations And from there, you could just go on to generate new species. But also those experiments in which they found flies with double sets of wings convinced many people that they were witnessing the origin of new species in the lab. So many people did not realize that if you want to prove from an evolutionary perspective a phenomenon that has taken place, or you want to analyze it, what you want to do is to construct a historical narrative. And the strongly empiricist trait of many convinced them that you don't see the process of evolution in the lab, therefore Darwin must be mistaken. And this was combined, of course, with other arguments like Lord Kelvin ideas that the Earth is very young and so on. But the mutationists were a very radical set of people that denied the possibility of natural selection, which I think is precisely the genius of people like Bright, like Fisher, like Haldane, and so on. There is no opposition. And of course, one should keep in mind that for them, evolution means simply a change in gene frequencies in the gene pool.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Hervé, we cannot hear you.
Yes, it's a. I try to shut off my my mic every time, but I always forget to put it on again. So another question by Naila Shaush. I'm going to read it. According to Oparin's theory, what would be the origin of ATP in the glycolysis of the primordial metabolism?
When Oparin first proposed his idea, even as late as 1936 with the second book, and nobody really knew for sure how you could produce ATP and so on. But there was a famous meeting in 1962-63 in Waukeula Falls in Florida that was convened by Sidney Fox. And in that meeting, Carl Sagan presented the work on the synthesis of ATP under possible primitive condition. This was, in fact, the first paper that Carl Sagan had published in Nature some time before, showing that you could have ATP under primitive conditions with UV light and so on. And you can actually trace the origin of that paper quite easily back to the exchanges that he had with Hermann Müller. The paper was presented there, and I discussed extensively the proceedings of that meeting with Oparin because he was there. The one who translated him from Russian into English was none other than Domshamsky, who was polite beyond belief because, of course, Domshamsky had left the Soviet Union running away from he was Menshevik, so he was running away from the Bolsheviks. But they got along extremely well, and that meeting was definitive in many ways because for the first time you could have together all the experimental developments after the Miller experiment and after the Oro experiment. And Oparin found very convincing the synthesis of ATP as proposed by Carl Sagan and reconfirmed by Joan Oro. You can find the book. It's published by Academic Press, and the editor is Sidney Fox. Now, of course, in the past 20 years, we have come to realize that it's not so easy to have ATP. We need a good phosphorus source on the primitive Earth and so on. But and by the way, I think that one of the very open questions in the origin of life is the origin of the bioenergetic processes.
Okay, thank you. Is there any other question? Maybe one for me. How did you get all these fantastic pictures, historic pictures of everywhere? What is your source?
Well, first of all, you should feel free to use them as much as you want. Absolutely. I mean, the more people have this material, the better. Actually, I remember that Hervé, you and me thought about making up a library of all the graphic material, and it's for you. I can send you the complete, in case it doesn't copy well from this page. I'll send them to you, and you should feel free to distribute them as much as you want. If the pictures don't have a reference, they were given to me by the authors, or you can use them without any problem. And the ones that I provide are free for everyone, and the other ones, is normal in science, you can use by quoting the origin. How did I get the other things? Well, whenever I went, for instance, to the United States or to the Soviet Union mostly, to talk with Oparin, to try to understand the story and so on, I took the pictures them myself, or material given to me by Oparin. And whenever I went to Houston, or to work with Joan Oro, or to work with Stanley Miller and Jeff Beda, I ran away immediately to the library to look at the archives. I took the photographs directly, which is the reason why some of them are not so good. Because I'm talking about working on the origins of life, I think raises for us the obligation on trying to understand the issue of what is life, how this question has changed in time, and how a field like this has been so influenced by political, scientific, ideological issues. And I think it's very important to keep that history and to make it available to all for future reinterpretations.
Okay, thank you very much. So I don't see any other question either in the chat or people raising hands. So I would like to thank everyone who stayed until the end. We ran a little bit over compared the regular timing, but well, I think it was really worth listening to you. Again, we really appreciate you give some of your time. I know you are extremely busy and fighting for science in Mexico, and I hope you enjoy to share this time with us and go back to the roots of your work and your passion for science about the origin of life. I've heard you plan some travel to France next year. Is it right?
Absolutely. I admire Pasteur, and I believe on vaccines. So I will have the third vaccine very soon. And I think it's in April. I will visit France. I have to talk with some friends, but yes, absolutely. And I'll be delighted to meet you and to meet everyone. And please feel free to contact me, by the way, should you need any reference or any material, all of you that so kindly attended the meeting. And yes, I mean, sure. We'll meet soon. It will be a pleasure to feel very much at home, as I always feel in France.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Antonio.